While many of our younger viewers may not have nostalgia for mass consumption and air conditioned shopping paradises, for those of us Gen Xers, the shopping mall was the last communal space. I met my first wife in a shopping mall. True story. And made lifelong friends at the mall as well. Nothing speaks to the Cold War nostalgia of American greatness quite like waxing poetic about these iconic shopping spaces. Malls were at a time so popular, music recording artists broke out into the mainstream via mall tours. Remember the 80s pop sensation Tiffany? But besides being a bastion of middle class suburban teenage angst and independence, what was the modern shopping mall truly meant to be in the heart of one of its early creators? What did the mall accomplish in helping to destroy the more common at the time of its inception downtown shopping areas, urban areas that were filled with actual public spaces, not privatized convenience? Today, we bring in writer and recent columnist for Sublation Magazine, Patrick Roesle. In an article for Sublation titled Malls, Fordism, and Socialism, Patrick writes, "But it's true, the mall was once new, ambitious, iconoclastic. Even superstar architects and designers were interested in making them. Influential critics in magazines like The New Yorker and Architectural Forum gushed over them. Women's Wear Daily columnist Samuel Feinberg was so impressed by the ultra-modern regional shopping centers of the late 1950s that he deliberately echoed the famous pronouncement of muckraker journalist Lincoln Stevens upon his return from the fledgling Soviet Union. I have seen the future, and it works. Some of this enthusiasm must be understood in the context of not only 1950s prosperity, but of the political, economic, and ideological complement to the United States post-war golden age. The ascendant consumer economy, fueled by the mass production and consumption of luxury goods, stood for an elaborate, integrated ideal of economic abundance and democratic political freedom, both equitably distributed, that became almost a national civil religion from the late 1940s into the 70s," writes Elizabeth Cohen in her epochal A Consumer's Republic. "The ideal provided the blueprint for American economic, social, and political maturation, as well as for export around the globe." Cohen notes that this particular strategy of guaranteeing and flouting American greatness had the Cold War era appeal of putting money in people's pockets by increasing the size of their economic pie without the socialistic resizing of any class slice. And for a while, it seemed to work. If the consumer economy was a civil religion, then the modern shopping mall was its cathedral. Again, that is from a piece in Sublation Magazine, Malls, Fordism, Socialism. Please welcome author Patrick Roesle.
Hello.
Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
My
Tonight.
pleasure.
And you're in the East Coast.
Yes, I'm in Philly. I grew up in North Jersey.
Oh, that's kind of mall heaven.
Yeah, I was within maybe 30 minutes distance from there was the Rockaway Town Square, which was the one that I frequented. There was the Livingston Mall. There was the Willowbrook Mall. There was the ultra bougie Short Hills Mall, which I didn't go to. There was the kind of crappy Ledgewood Mall that was one story, didn't have a fountain, but also was the place where the kids went to play Magic the Gathering. So I spent a bunch of my time in middle school there. But
Okay.
the place I came up with was very suburban and very mollified.
Now, what was kind of the impetus for you to want to write about this? Because as Sublation columnists, they don't give us assignments.
Right. I read there was a book that was released in 2022, Alexandra Lang's Meet Me by the Fountain. It ran the circuit of all like the usual like sites in the liberal chatosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, I was a mall rat growing up. I worked at malls for years,
Mm-hmm.
and I picked up the book and I read it, and there was a lot that I enjoyed, but it got a little bit stuck in my craw.
Was it too nostalgic for you?
Nostalgia I can deal with. I was actually rereading chunks of it in preparation for this, and it's funny because I wrote the article just to sort of like get salt out of my system out of reading the book. And now I'm like wondering like wherefore salt? Why did it get under my skin the way it did? And I think on the one hand, I think there's a lot of, I don't even want to say it's unalloyed nostalgia because she rattles off this whole list of problems with the mall historically. Like
Mm,
early on in the book, she just runs down this itemized list built on colonized land, often built on wetlands, contributed to white flight from the cities and urban blight, helped to lock in the middle class whiteness of the American suburbs. But then she turns around and says, and basically talks about it's just malls are so much fun. It's great to go to a mall with your friends and your kids and get Starbies and shop for apparel. And she says, I'm basically quoting that you go to malls to shop for your true selves. It it's a little bit too more of an apology, too much. It's more apologetic of the mall than makes me comfortable. But at the same time, I think what really rereading it, what really got stuck in my craw was the fact that in a way, she's a realist. I can't decide whether she's a realist or if she lacks imagination, but
mm,
when she says something to the effect that, like, people who are dancing on the graves of dead malls are failing to acknowledge the alternatives,
mhm.
she's right. These things, the suburbs were built around these things, and there's not much else in the way of community spaces except for shopping spaces that really work in the context of the suburbs.
Well, let's actually talk about the early days of suburbs. I think people, depending on the history that you know about maybe places like Levittown, suburbs were, and you mentioned this in your piece as well, created in the kind of the hinterlands. Or one of the reasons we had so much post World War II growth was we had all this open space. So as all these suburbs are being built, people still have to travel very far to get into the urban core to shop. And so when these malls are created, um, some people are creating them with a little bit more in mind of community space, especially someone that I do want to talk about in this episode, Victor Gruen, who comes from, I believe it's Austria, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
and is a socialist and has a different vision of a mall where it's like there's a hospital and there's schools and you know for those that don't know, a big part of the pushback on public housing, which has kind of always been talked about and thrown around in the early days, even before World War II, in places like Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles, one of the pushbacks was it was too socialistic or communistic to have these wonderful places. And then also real estate barons didn't really want to make public housing in the US context anything like what was happening across the pond. So the mall, um, in its inception, is kind of a modern marvel of architecture. Did you want to kind of talk about that?
I'm not even sure where to begin. Well, we can talk about Victor Gruen.
Yeah, let's start with
He
Victor.
was born in 1903 in Austria.
Mhm,
He was trained as an architect. He was the director of the Socialist Event Group, a political cabaret in Vienna from 1926 through 1934. Um, was a big admirer of I'm just going to mispronounce his name, Joseph Popper Linkius, who was late 19th century, early 20th century thinker who more or less predicted the modern welfare state or called for something like it.
mhm,
He fled the Nazis in 1938 and lived in New York. His first job, or one of his first jobs, was working to design Bell Ged's Futurama exhibition that was uh, he was contracted to build for GM. So Gruen, who it's no who was a man who later in life just despised the automobile and what it did to urban design, was
yeah,
the for one of his earliest jobs in the United States was he helped to design this exhibition that basically called for a giant freeway system that would crisscross the country and make it so that GM would never have to worry about selling cars ever again. And at the time, it was a marvel. Giant freeways, overpasses, underpasses, cloverleaf patterns, nothing that existed at the time. Gruen said that no one working on it really anticipated this ever really happening. He just knew that he was being paid $50 a week to do it as a
Mhm.
very recent emigre to the United States. But from there, he got some jobs in Manhattan designing stores and storefronts for like candy shops and leather goods stores, made a name for himself, designed some department stores on the West Coast, and then moved to LA and hated LA. He called it a non city because its reliance, even in the early 30s and 40s,
Mhm.
its reliance on the automobile, which was being designed around automobile use. He said that anything like urbanity was impossible in
Well,
such an
LA is the
environment.
modern city, right? We have to
Yes,
remember that that is, for those that haven't read Mike Davis, there's also other good books about the interstate system, but Los Angeles is not like New York in that regard, where New York is kind of, at least the city, is built around public transportation. Los Angeles is definitely built around urban sprawl and needing
right.
an automobile to get around the vastness of Los Angeles County.
So to go ahead with Gruen's story, um, he continued to design department stores on the West Coast, and he did a lot of flying around the country. And in the late 1940s, I forget exactly what year it was, there was a snowstorm and it brought down his plane in Detroit. And he was stuck there for a while, so he got a colleague's family member to give him a tour of the town. And he was not a fan of Detroit. He talked about it being desolate and run down, with the one exception of the Hudson's department store in the middle of the city, which was owned by a fellow named Oscar Weber at that point. It was just this beacon of prosperity and modernity among just this ramshackle industrial town, and it left a big impression on him. And when he was telling the person who was showing him around, like he is giving him his candid opinion on downtown Detroit, saying he didn't like it. His friend said, "Oh, no, 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 yeah, we nothing happens downtown. Like all life is in the suburbs." And so the next day he took him to the suburbs, and I'm just going to read to you his description of the outlying areas around Detroit.
Mhm.
This is from Victor Gruen's autobiography, posthumously published. The rest of the outlying area that was not covered by industry resembled a patchwork quilt. It was composed of small lots of land with small yards and medium sized lots with medium yards. On each plot sat a boxy house with a completely useless piece of lawn. This yard was the calling card of the home's inhabitants, and it was constantly edited with a lawnmower. On the road facing sides of the houses were rarely used living rooms with oversized windows, called picture windows. In passing, it seemed to me that through each of these windows I saw the same floor lamp with plastic shade, the same vase, the same flowers on the same table. This was what lay between the main roads. The main roads themselves were zoned exclusively for business. Here a motley collection of large and small companies had settled, a garishly advertised parade of filling stations, hot dog stands, department stores, snack bars, liquor stores, supermarkets, chain stores, used car lots, and funeral parlors. Most of these enterprises were housed in buildings of only one story and were dependent on roadside parking. In exceptional cases, parking spaces were provided in front of or behind a row of buildings, in which case the block then proudly called itself a mall. Included were three large department stores, all branch locations of national companies. Although these main streets were extraordinarily wide, they could not accommodate the combined burdens of shopping traffic, parking, the delivery and shipping of goods, and pedestrian needs. To escape the endless traffic jams, one had to park on the residential streets. The generously planned major road network had become unusable. In a city where there was no notable public transportation system, an ambitious urban motorway network had ruthlessly torn the residential areas into pieces.
Mm.
Everyone concerned cursed the roads, and there were numerous protest movements against them. But when confronted with the argument that without motorways they could not reach their jobs in the auto industry, the protesters capitulated. So
Really? Wow.
so Gruen saw this problem of urban decay and he saw this problem of suburban sprawl.
Mhm.
Between looking at these pell-mell unplanned suburbs and looking at the Hudson's department store in the middle of Detroit, this beacon of civilization among all of this desolation, he's inspired. He'd written before in an architectural forum. I believe it was architectural forum in the 1943. They had this issue about like what America of the future, and he described um, well, even back then he called it a mall, as in a large promenade. It would have been this pedestrian-only space with just a central department store and walkways with stores that didn't face the streets but faced inward, and there would be benches, places to sit down, gardens, etc., etc. And at the time, it got a lot of attention. And he went to the head of the Hudson's department store company, this fellow named Oscar Weber, and pitched him this idea, like, you need to branch out into the suburbs, and he basically appealed to this man's sense of civic responsibility. He said the suburbs are a wreck that needs order and planning, and as a pillar of the business community of Detroit, it's the onus is on you to do this. And Weber said, yeah, okay, let's do this. And what he ended up doing was building the proto shopping mall. It was the Northland Shopping Center in Southfield, Michigan, and it was open for business in 1956. And it was basically a shopping mall, except that it was outdoors. The Hudson's department store was in the center of this thing, and you had walkways and inwards facing shops, and all of the parking was abutted it, so you could get out of your car and walk around this place. And at the time, it was a sensation. Journalists, it was a site of pilgrimage for journalists. All of the architectural magazines gushed about it. Eleanor Roosevelt toured it and wrote a glowing review of it. And so that wasn't the first shopping mall proper. That was the Northland Center in Southfield, Michigan. That opened up in my mistake. That was Edina, Minnesota. It was 1956,
Mhm.
and it was the anchor for that store. That one was driven by Weber's friend and colleague who owned the Dayton department store, which incidentally, the Hudson's in Dayton, after decades of acquisitions and mergers, ended up joining together and becoming Target in 2000. So
Oh, wow. Okay,
yeah, so the original malls were underwritten by the companies that would later on become Target.
big box stores that
And
kind of ended up not
right.
killing them all, but changing
Yeah,
the way suburban shopping
right.
functions.
The history of the mall and suburbanization is just a history of just cannibalizing.